Okay, so welcome back to what is now public session of the Children and Family Scrutiny Board. To fill in the gap, what has just been described to the board is a circumstance where the partners, the health partners, the police partners and the council disagreed about notifying a case. And we've had some discussion about that. What I'd like to, I've got a few more questions to Jasvinder before I open questions to the board for Jasvinder, and then I'll invite Councillor Venner and Sal to respond, and we'll take further questions then. So with what we've just heard, Jasvinder, are there any other occasions where the partners have disagreed?
So just to go back to the review advisory group deals with the most vulnerable cases with the most serious harm, and that is where partners collectively will have a conversation to consider whether or not a case in front of us warrants a notification to the national panel. And we have had recently another case come before us with respect to very young children, where two partners, on the basis of evidence, it was their view, the case met the criteria. And as I said before, that as chair, I'm not a decision maker. You know, it's a very complex meeting. I can guide discussion. Rebecca, our legal advisor, was at that meeting, and she will guide us on the definitions and the legality of the judgment and the conversations we're having. But what we always consider is this more serious as opposed to not being serious? And what will the longer term impact be on that child or the children in this case? That particular case, the local authority did say they would go away and consider and reflect. And they came back and they decided not to notify. Two of the partners, police and health, felt very strongly that it should have been considered. And as chair, I decided to take this particular case to my executive board. Now, I wouldn't ordinarily do that, but I have to sleep with myself at night. I'm here to make a difference. I'm here representing safeguarding children. I'm not political about safeguarding. This is about making a difference. And if one of my roles is to drive improvements on the basis of the most horrendous cases we see, then we have to look very closely at them. So it did go to our executive board, and we had a meeting at the last exec. And the executive board is made up again of three partners. So we have our executive health member, Joe Harding, a police member, if Superintendent Damien Miller, and Sal Tariq represents Children's Services. And there was a conversation at that meeting. But all I will tell you is that it's still not going to be a notification. So at the moment, that case will have to be considered in terms of the learning from that case that we need to do in a different way. So that's what I can say on that.
Okay, and in these instances, without any specifics, a yes or no will be quite sufficient. Were these cases known to child protection?
Yes.
Thank you. And my final question before I open it to the board, how many other cases are you aware of, or could there be, where a notification should have been considered and wasn't?
Well, this is a case in point. I have no idea how many cases are being considered for notification. And this is why we're having the review, because we're asking for the rationale to be recorded and to be shared amongst partners. But in terms of the system itself, and it is a system issue as well, we need to consider those that are not being notified and to share that amongst partners, because partners may have a different view. And that's the point I'm making, that the collaborative partnership arrangements are such that we as partners need to be working within this space collectively. The decision may sit with the local authority, but those conversations beforehand are the most critical conversations. So actually, to answer your question, I have no idea.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions that I have. Before we bring in Sal and Councillor Venner, I'd like to invite any board members to ask questions of Jasvinder. So I saw Helen first, I think, and then Councillor Gruen. Just leave your hands up if you wanted to speak.
I just wanted to ask the review advisory group, who is on that group? Are the partners on that group, or is it more a closed group? And then also, it seems that if there is a disagreement over cases, those cases that were looked at are not recorded anywhere. And that seems a big problem, because then they're not open to the more widely for other people to relook at those.
So in answer to your first question, the review advisory group representatives are health, police and children's services. So they will be the deputies for the executive board members. Then Rebecca attends as our legal advisor, and then I will chair that meeting. All those meetings are minuted. They're all minuted. So we do have minutes for that meeting. They're not public meetings, but they are minuted. So that the minutes are recorded. So the discussions are recorded. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Gruen is next, please.
I just wanted you to clarify what you meant when you said Leeds was an outlier with regard to notifications. Is that because Leeds does a lot more or a lot less than other places?
Just to clarify, I didn't say Leeds was an outlier. The national panel chair, Annie Hudson, made that comment in a meeting. That's the first thing to note. Yeah, I mean, the point is that in terms of notifications and how many notifications are made by this city, historically, the point she made was they are lower compared to other cities. So what we are doing as part of the review is we are comparing ourselves to other cities with respect to, why that is. But nationally, the national panel have, in their report of 2020, they highlight inconsistencies in national notifications. But the fact that the chair of national panel made that point to me is something that we need to be considering, well, I certainly need to consider, and that is something that we'll be looking at within the review.
Thank you. Rebecca just wanted to make a point, I think.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just to clarify that the notification process came in September 2019, when the responsibility changed from being a joint responsibility of the board as to whether or not to undertake serious case reviews, and fell to the responsibility of the local authority. So if any figures are referred to historically, if they're pre-September 2019, that's when the board arrangements were in place, where decisions were the equal responsibility of the three members of the board, namely health, police and children's services.
Thank you for that. Councillor Carter, please.
Councillor Gruen actually beat me to one of the questions, but I do have another actually, Chair. I'm struggling to understand why other partners would disagree with children's services when we see a case like we have just alluded to, which is clearly in anybody's eyes, as far as I can see, is extremely serious and has a damaging effect on the child. So I wonder if you could explain to me, Jasvinder, what the rationale was given by children's services or the police and health. Why did they disagree on it?
Chair, if we're referring to the first case, I'm afraid I don't have the rationale. And this has been part of the problem in terms of rationale needs to be recorded. We are changing that now. So I don't have the rationale. But when the partners are considering whether or not something meets the definition that we have to consider, they base that on evidence. They base that on scoping. They will base that on information from partners that comes into the Rapid Review Advisory Group meeting. So you would scope where this child has been involved in agencies, etc. Everything would be scoped. So on the basis of that and their judgment, that's when they would make a judgment. So they can put that forward and give their opinions, and all opinion, for me, that should be a level playing field when you're sharing those judgments and opinions as professionals. But if the local authority make the decision to hear that conversation and then not decide to notify, well, then that's the legal position. That's the law. So it's difficult for me to say. I mean, maybe our children's services at the table here can explain the recording of rationale and what the thinking is behind. But what I can tell you is that in all cases at the Review Advisory Group, we will always consider the definition and the criteria, and we will always consider the impact on that child's life and whether we need to learn something from this. And if we need to look at this as a rapid review closely, we're doing that very quickly to identify rapid learning, to identify where we need to make improvements, and whether the big question for me is, did the system pick it up? And if it didn't, then we need to consider that, and consider that very quickly.
Okay, thank you. Jackie, please.
I think, in my view, from the limited information that I have, I think there's probably a gap between one system and another. We've gone from the old system and we now in a new system, and I think there might be probably gaps which need to be looked at.
Thank you. I think that some perhaps we pick up in our conclusions and further work on this. Got Councillor Stevenson next, please.
Thanks, Chair. I've got two questions. The first, I think, will probably come to Rebecca. Jasvinder just said that of the serious cases she's concerned about, a notification still hasn't been made. And I think we heard that it's only the local authority that can make that notification. So is there, within the constitution of the council or otherwise, a mechanism that can force that notification to be made if the Children and Families Directorate is refusing to do it? I.e., if that was a resolution of, so if the safeguarding chair made a concern to the executive board and the executive board made a resolution, could that trigger it, or is it just down to the director to make that judgment call?
Thank you, Councillor Stevenson. It is the duty of Children's Services, ultimately headed up by the director, to make that decision. I'm sure he will be informed by all of the information that is gathered by the social work team and cascaded upwards through the management tree to him when he ultimately makes that decision whether to notify or not. But no, I don't believe there is any other scope within the Constitution to override that, and I don't think that would be possible either.
Okay, perhaps we'll come back to that in recommendations, Chair. My second question is to Jasvinder, and I think at this stage I want to say your personal commitment, Jasvinder, has shone through here this morning to the issue, and I'm sure that it is not an easy thing for you to come here today and share what you've shared with us, and we commend you for that. In terms of the serious cases that you've mentioned, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the other review cases that are going on, and there was mentioned to one earlier, and my mind went to the J review as well. In your opinion, in the cases you've raised concern about, is your belief that, or has it ever been inferred to you that the reputation of the panel or Children's Services is a consideration at all when deciding to take action or indeed not to take appropriate action?
Not with respect to considering a case. No, not whether I should consider the reputation. No. But I have to say that on the last case where there hasn't been agreement, I have suggested that I take it to the national panel, to Annie Hudson, the chair of the national panel, and with due respect, ensuring that we do not name children, absolutely, so totally anonymizing it, to seek another view. And I have done that. But what I would like to go back to, if I may, Councillor Stevenson, is that question you raise about the constitutional position with regards to notifications, and being in this position yet again led me to be having a conversation with the national panel, because that doesn't sit with me. And what I was informed was that we could consider, albeit it may not be constitutional, a retrospective notification. And I did discuss that at the review advisory group. So you can go back and look at a notification decision. Something else might come up and you may consider a retrospective notification. So I was given that advice and we did have that conversation. But there still wasn't a notification. So I'm interested in children and young people, and I appreciate you commending me for coming here. And I'm here as a last resort, in all honesty, because the system, in terms of notification and the practice, I raised concerns about that last year. And yes, we are driving towards making improvements, but in the here and now, I'm still in the position whereby there's another case that's been highlighted. And we are still in that position where two partners feel very strongly that it is notifiable in the interest of learning, in the interest of children. And that's in the here and now. So I don't know if I've answered your question, Councillor Stevenson, but I do hope the point about retrospective notifications helps, albeit it's not written into any constitution.
Thank you for that. Councillor Lay, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jacinda. Jacinda. Like Ryan, Councillor Stevenson, I want to commend you for coming, because I don't like to make judgments about people's feelings. I'm not in a position to say what people are feeling, but it feels like I'm perceiving that you're incredibly angry and frustrated. Some of the language that you've used suggests that. You're kept awake at night. You're astounded by the decision. Serious harm, in my view. But you, at the same time, are clearly passionate about being the voice and advocate and ally of the young people and children in this city, and you want to make a difference. You've just said that you've come here as a last resort. Have you at any time, has this been such a difficult position that you're in, that you've considered your position? That's a simple question.
Yes, I have actually considered my position. Accountability for child protection is collective. It always has to be collective. This is about partnership. And in my role, there is only so much I can do. And I feel the frustration of partners actually as well, who quite rightly, based on evidence, will come forward and give their views based on evidence, I will say again, with respect to why they deem something to have met the criteria of serious harm. And then to have that view not considered in the way they would expect, for me, is frustrating. Let me be clear, I'm not angry. This is my job. I'm here to scrutinise, to challenge. You employ me to be objective. That's my role. And this is about children. And albeit the local authority has the duty, I'll go back to saying again, this was Rebecca's point, this is a collective responsibility with regards to the collaboration before we get to that point of who's going to notify or not.
I guess my second point would be, I'm surprised that as an independent chair, you don't have the authority to make notifications, and that you say yourself that you're not a decision maker when we have Ofsted, we have CQC, we have a variety of other bodies in other sectors of local and national government that do have that independence. And I, you know, there's no question to this. I just find it amazing that you cannot compel the partners to make a notification, and it seems like a flaw in the legislation.
Did you want to come back, Jasvinder?
I completely agree, and I have made that point clear to Annie Hudson, and it is my intention to write to the Education Minister to have a conversation about this, because it seems we have to lead collectively in the interest of children, and yet this particular piece of legislation, in my humble opinion, doesn't appear to facilitate that partnership working in the way I would expect it to. And that's the point. And maybe it's a national issue. I don't know. But I certainly intend to advocate that as an independent chair. It's about doing the right thing.
Thank you. I've got three more contributors, and I'm very conscious that I want to make sure that Sal and Councillor Venner have a good opportunity to put their views across as well. So if I can take Celia first, please.
Thank you, Chair. There's a few points, but it's getting a bit confusing with people's feelings and emotions, understandably. But this system was changed quite recently. Prior to that change, the decision making was within the partnership, as I understand it, but that's rhetorical, correct me if I'm wrong. And we're discussing whether there should have been notification for a rapid review. Is that correct? And a rapid review is roughly to look at any necessity, like feedback, critique of the systems that were used, the way the partners worked. And then final point, in the case of a majority of the partners wanting this notification for a review, rapid review, can you, as chair, request the rationale for them not making that notification?
Absolutely. And it should be a matter of course that rationale should be documented and shared amongst partners. And that is happening now. I'm not sure about the past, but just to make the point in terms of the change, in all the cases that we consider, we always consider the point that Rebecca made in terms of the definition, and that is if a serious incident is abuse, neglect of a child known or suspected, and if the child's been seriously harmed. And a rapid review is about gathering the facts of the case rapidly. That's the point of a rapid review, you know, for us to consider any immediate action. And we have to do that as quickly as possible in the interest of the child's safety and for the potential for learning. That's the point of a rapid review.
Thank you. I've got Helen, please.
And this is a bit of a difficult question to ask, but are there any implications for the review body for putting in a retrospective notification when they've originally decided not to put in a notification that would mean they'd be less likely to make a retrospective notification?
Can you just repeat that?
So So it's whether there are any implications for a review body putting in a retrospective notification, which would mean that they'd be less likely to want to do that.
I'm not, forgive me if I don't understand the question appropriately, but the guidance that I received from the national panel was that you could consider a retrospective notification because new information may come to light. There may be, you know, other things happening that you didn't know before, and therefore you could consider a retrospective notification. So I'm not sure about what implications there would be.
Just in terms of reputation, in terms of having to say maybe we were wrong in the first instance.
I think it's really good practice to be able to put your hand up and say we got this wrong, actually. So I'm not too concerned about the reputational risk, and that's the culture that we need to promote. That open culture to say, actually, you know, we didn't get this right. Let's have a look at this and let's review this. And that is something that I feel this system can promote and achieve across the city amongst the partnerships. So I don't see that as being, I would never consider that in terms of an implication. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I've got, before we move on, I've got Councillor Carter and then Andrew, and then I'm going to move on at this point.
For me, that's key, Jasvinder. What you just said is that it's about learning and putting your hand up and saying, we got this completely wrong. We need to learn from it. And time after time with reviews and domestic homicide reviews, when children sadly die, there's always learning to be learned, but they're always the same lessons, aren't they, when you look there? For me, I still can't get my head round why police and health have not been taken seriously, because it says here in the Children's Act of 2004, which surely everybody should have been taking seriously and using as good practice, the definition of neglect is the persistent failure to meet a child's basic physical and or psychological needs likely to result in the serious impairment of the child's health or development. So that should have been taken on board by all of the partners since 2004. And I'm still finding it very difficult to say, well, since Ofsted or since whenever that was, we are taking it on board. So how many other children, how many other cases have slipped through the net where learning could have been taking place? They could have learned from that should have gone to the review and hasn't.
I can't numerically give you any numbers in relation to that, but what I can say is that within the review advisory group do consider learning, and we do look at themes, and there may be consistent themes. I do think that we need to consider the impact of that learning and how we evidence the impact of change, and that needs to be strengthened. Because as you say, you know, there's no point in doing a review if you're not going to evidence what has changed as a result of that. And there is a need to do some real work around that to improve that.
Thank you. And finally, Andrew, please.
Thank you, Chair. Jasvinder, can I just ask you, for my own understanding, can you say why that collective responsibility for decision-making was removed in September 2019? Because presumably there was something around that system was perceived not to be good enough in some way?
I'm looking at Rebecca because I think Rebecca is the appropriate person to answer. Yeah.
Not at all, thank you. Jasvinder, and I suspect it will go back to Sir Alan Wood and his review of 2015-2016, that when he looked at the arrangements for safeguarding boards, he looked at the way in which decisions were made as to whether or not a serious case review should be undertaken. And there was similar criteria applied there as well that reflects the current legislation. And my understanding and my reading of his review is that that was a decision that needed to be put in the hands of one organisation, and that may well contribute towards making new arrangements, new safeguarding arrangements more effective, more efficient, and reach that learning more quickly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much, Jasvinder. But I very much see you as staying as part of the discussion as we continue. So just to summarise what we've heard and to repeat my rationale for bringing this here today, we have heard that the independent chair of the Safeguarding Partnership raised serious concerns, which resulted in a review being undertaken last year. And for whatever reason, nobody felt it was appropriate to bring it to this board and to my attention as the chair. I find that astonishing and not acceptable. And I take on board the points made by Councillor Lennox and Councillor Marshall-Cattung that it's required a lot of information to come to the board, and I would have much preferred that we'd heard and learnt about this issue in a different way, but we weren't given that opportunity, and that's why I felt it's appropriate to bring it in this way today so that the board can then decide what they want to do. So I'm going to hand over to Councillor Venner and Sal to respond to what they've heard, and then we'll open it to questions.
Yeah, thank you. The first point I'd like to make to the board is just to really get across to you, and I hope you know this anyway from all the many times we've met with you, that Jasvinder is not the only person in this room who's absolutely passionate about children, about their well-being, their safety, their development. All of us who are involved in the Safeguarding Children's Partnership, all of us who have a leadership role in this Council for Children, have an absolute fierce dedication to children and to their safety and to their well-being and to Leeds being a positive place for children to be. And Sal and Julie in particular, who are sat either side of me, have spent their entire working lives as children's champions, as children's advocates, and, you know, have delivered really outstanding services for children in Leeds. As Rebecca has outlined, there's a new system around notification that came in 2019. What I would really want to stress to the board is that notifications and rapid reviews is one way that learning happens after there's a serious incident. It is not the only way. And if we don't notify on a case, it absolutely does not mean that is not considered, that's not reviewed, and learning takes place. And Julie and Sal have much more detail around that than I do operationally. But there is learning in all serious cases, and notifications is just one aspect of that, but there are other review processes. With reference to the comment that Jasvinder made that Annie had sort of made about Leeds being an outlier, we were previously, before 2019, we did make less notifications. Rebecca, I believe, has the data that we are not an outlier now in terms of the notifications we make in comparison to other core cities or in comparison to other places in West Yorkshire. However, the point I'd also make is that Leeds delivers outstanding services for children, and as such, you might expect that we would make less notifications in the same way that Leeds has less children in care and at the extreme end of its services than some of our neighbouring authorities. However, having said that, we are not an outlier, but we do have, as you know, a really excellent social work service and early help offer that supports children in the city. It is absolutely the case that there has been disagreement between partners on notification, but as Rebecca has outlined, and as has come out in the conversation, the legislation states that it is the local authority that notifies. And it was really interesting, the conversation about why that change was made. But actually, what it does in effect is vest that responsibility in social work, because the local authority is the body that notifies, and that is the Director of Children's Services, who is almost always a senior social worker. DCSs don't have to be, but they almost always are. And social work is, of course, the profession that is most imbued in child protection. So the local authority that is making the notification is also the body that is managing all the cases where children are on child in need and child protection plans, and is absolutely immersed in child protection issues all the time. What I would also say is I know that SEL takes peer advice on these issues from other DCSs. So when we're making a decision about whether to notify or not, we are, of course, absolutely taking into account the views of our partners in terms of health and the police. Sal and Julia are also drawing on their own vast professional experience and at times taking peer advice from other people in similar roles. And in the case of the most recent case where there is a disagreement, I'm very aware of that case, as is Tom. So, and frankly, obviously, given the disagreement there has been, it would have been much easier for Sal to say, yes, I believe this should be a notification, because it would be easier in terms of that relationship. But it is Sal's professional view as a very, very experienced, nationally recognised social worker that it doesn't meet the case for notification. And as the law is at the moment, that does rest with Sal and with the local authority. Because of the disagreement and because we value our partners, we are doing a review of the notification process, which has been referred to extensively, and we will report back to Scrutiny on that. And we have also requested input from the national panel, because this is a national issue. As has been referred to multiple times, it's a new system nationally that came in 2019, and Jasvinder's referred to inconsistencies in reporting processes. This is a national issue. So the reason we've requested support from the national panel is so they can help us individually, but also because we're flagging up, that there are some challenges around the notification process as it currently stands. And as Jasvinder stated, we've also asked the national panel to give us another opinion on the most recent case, where we've said, no, we won't notify, but the other partners think that we should. But we are bringing in another opinion on that matter, which Sal and I are in support of. With regard to coming to scrutiny, and this is a reference to Councillor Marshall Carter and Councillor Lennox's point, I did request of the chair that this come in March rather than today, so that we could have written a fuller report. You could have had more information. You would have been able to consider it in advance rather than getting information the night before and having to consider it then. Although I also do take into account the chair's points that we haven't brought this sooner, but frankly, we will, until we've done the review, you're not getting a full picture of where we are, and we will bring the review report back to Scrutiny. Also in March, the Children's Safeguarding Chair and Adult Safeguarding Chair annual reports going to Exec Board. So that would have coincided with that had it come in March as well, but we will bring the review back to Scrutiny. I'll conclude as I started, which is just to reiterate that all of us who are involved in children's services in Leeds at a senior level, and all of us who are involved in the Safeguarding Children's Partnership, are absolutely committed to the safety of children in Leeds and absolutely passionate about doing the right thing by them. And I take incredibly seriously my very privileged role as being advocate for some of the most vulnerable children in this city. And we will come back to you and discuss this further when we've completed the review. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bennett. Just to clarify as well, there was no plan to bring this to the board in March. So everybody's clear on that. Sal, did you want to come in?
Yes, thanks, Councillor Lamb. And obviously, I think we've covered off the issue about comments in relation to specific cases, which I'm not able to make, given the sensitive nature of them and where they are at the moment. I think part of looking at this is about the fact that These are new arrangements that came into place in September 2019, and we have been working nationally and locally on how to implement those recommendations. And it's not just here in Leeds where there are issues in terms of agreements or disagreements about which cases meet that criteria of serious or otherwise. It is, as Jasvinder said, the most serious cases that should come for consideration. Most of the work that comes into children's services meets a threshold of significant harm. So when that threshold is met, we tend to have children subject to child protection plans or children who come into the care system. All of that work continues. But where there is either a child death or a serious harm, then those cases, those small number of cases, need to be considered for notification and learning. But it is not just the notification that leads to the learning, and we've had quite a lot of conversations about how else we might do that learning within our organisations, because I think part of where Sir Alan Wood was getting to in terms of his review was that there were extensive reviews that were taking place, safeguarding reviews that were taking place that were coming up with very similar recommendations, but we weren't seeing the impact or changes in practice. And much of those previous reviews were undertaken by independent people who weren't necessarily engaged with the practitioners that are involved on a day-to-day basis for that specific child or young person. I've spoken to Jasvinder quite a lot about a number of times I've offered to bring in somebody from outside of the country to help us with this, who's got expertise in how to undertake restorative reviews, and we've not been able to move to that position. Because I think that one of the other issues that people have already talked about is the challenges that there are in terms of safeguarding practitioners in all agencies, but particularly in social work. And what we don't want, what the Wood Review was trying to move away from was a blame culture into a much more learning culture, so that you start to see the impact of the learning that takes place. And I think that we have done some of that type of work here. We've done appreciative inquiries where things have gone well, but we've also done learning events where the actual practitioners that are involved in a particular child's life, and when that results in a serious incident, that we bring those practitioners together, because I think that that's where the richest learning can happen, both in terms of understanding why people made the particular decisions that they did in those circumstances. What was the thinking and the emotion that was behind it at the time? You're not going to get to that from a remote position. So that brings you a richness of learning, not only in terms of what those people can learn, but also what other practitioners in the system can learn. So I just want to make it clear that we are open to learning. There's there's a practice review going on in terms of the first matter that you mentioned, and we'll get to a point of whether that does need to be retrospectively notified. But in the other matter, again, we're undertaking some rapid learning so that can be fed back into the national panel, and we can have a discussion with them about whether they feel it should have been notified in the first instance. I think the other thing that I would say is just this bit about outliers. I do consult with other directors of children's services about circumstances in which they might notify or otherwise, and given that previously all three partners contributed to that decision, and we made very few notifications. We are now, those increased in the first year after the arrangements came in and have continued to increase, and we've made 5 notifications in this last year.
Okay, thank you. So I've got a couple of questions myself before I bring others in. First of all, neither yourself or Councillor Venner have addressed the point that this serious issue was raised with you and you didn't see it as being appropriate to bring it to this board and to my attention as chair of the board, and you didn't address that in your opening comments. And the second question I'd have really is to Rebecca, is what I think I heard you say is there are, in fact I did hear you say there are different ways to learn lessons and you are choosing different ways to learn lessons. My understanding from what Rebecca has described to us is it is set out in statutes when a notification should and shouldn't be made, and the threshold for doing that is very clear. And therefore, it is not really in our gift as an authority to decide that we would like to follow a different path at times. Am I wrong in what I've heard and understood?
Yeah, sorry. What I'm saying is that there are a broader range of ways to learn, and you can conduct even the notified and formal reviews. You can conduct them in a multitude of different ways in order to ensure that that learning takes place. I was comparing the current position to how it used to be historically, where we had a lot of serious case reviews, where it was felt that they were coming up with very similar things. They took a long time to complete and were often done remotely from the practitioners that had been actively involved in the cases. So there are methodologies that you can use, but we do learning on more cases than we decide to notify on, and we obviously have other audit activity that takes place both on a multi-agency and on an agency by agency basis, which is also an opportunity to learn. On your other point, I've apologised to you about not bringing this matter previously. It's not part of a planned mission. Purposefully, we have been operating in a pandemic under a lot of pressure, and we were on with trying to review the processes so that we have a stronger position in terms of how we make notifications.
Okay, thank you. Tony,
just the other point that you raised there, Councillor, the issue about serious harm is about applying professional judgment, and so there is something about the fact that there are differences nationally that the national panel have said. Annie Hudson has said herself that it's difficult because it is a subjective decision. It's not it's not this one situation does meet it, this one situation doesn't. You have to apply judgment in terms of coming to that consideration.
Thank you. I might come back to that, but there's other people waiting to ask questions. So I've got Tony first, please.
It's always difficult to make decisions when you've not got all the facts. And in this particular case, I don't think we've got all the facts. But so we can only make the decisions on what we know. Now, presumably when this body was set up, there were 3 experts part of it. There was the local authority in social services, there was the law, and there was health. It seems strange to me that if 2 of that body turn around and say, we think there is a need for notification, that the 3rd part, even though it being the senior part that can make the decisions, turns around and says, we're going to ignore the advice of these other experts, and we're going to make a judgment, not necessarily by giving any sort of reasoning, but by just saying we don't accept this, so therefore it won't go to notification. that seems to me very, very, very strange. The other thing that seems to be very strange is that there seems to be a fear of notification. Now, the problem is, to me, that if we are safeguarding children, why should we bar one other step towards making sure that adds to that learning, that adds to that information, and so on? It seems very strange to me that we block it off. Now, I don't know why that happens. Perhaps I can explain why it's done. But the other thing is, and the thing that brought this here, if Javinda hadn't raised this point with Councillor Lamb, would this scrutiny board ever have known about it? Have we had, how many cases in the past have happened that this scrutiny board have not known about? And can we prevent that happening in the future?
I mean, again, I can't go into the specifics around the case, but a number of things happen over a period of time in terms of that particular matter, and there is context above and beyond the headline that's reported in the news and that you've talked about, that I can't get into here. You know, it would be in the course of our business something that we would have wanted to bring here. I think we would have picked it up, given that we've got the annual report going to executive board. But you know, that doesn't preclude the fact that I've apologised that we could have brought it here sooner.
Can I come back?
I'm not referring to one individual case. That individual case is sub judice as far as I'm concerned. What is the thing is, what I'm asking is, how many cases have in the past have happened which have not been referred to this board?
Just to come back on a couple of points, we don't have a fear of notifications. We've made 5 recently, as Sal outlined, and also we're not ignoring the views of health or the police at all. We work extensively with them, and we work very positively and productively with them from the front line to the most senior level. But we have disagreed with them on a couple of occasions, and as has been outlined, it is the local authority decision as it is set out in law whether or not we notify, and Sal makes that decision based on all the information that he has. That includes the input from health, the input from the police, all Sal's other knowledge that he has of the case, his professional experience and other advice that he might take. So it's absolutely not the case that we're ignoring people's views, but we just do disagree, which happens when you're working in partnership. With regard to the question about how many cases, obviously there are significant numbers of children in Leeds, as in any city, who are at risk, and they are on child protection plans. So as Sal said earlier, children's services, although we work with the children that are most at risk in the city, that is the nature of our work. When children end up in a child in need or child protection plan, they are at risk by definition of harm. But that doesn't mean that all those cases result in situations which need to be notified. But I think the board need to have that awareness that obviously we are working in an arena, you know, of the safety and protection of children. So we are always, on any day, supporting a significant number of children and families where there is risk of harm, and our role is to keep those children and those families safe and together where it's safe for them to be together. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lay, please.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think anyone questions the commitment of the Children's Services team. But I have to say, as a new member, first year member of Children's Family Scrutiny Board, up until this point, I had absolute faith in our services. This has shaken my faith in our service. We have an independent chair of scrutiny safeguarding who has considered resignation. We have two partners who disagree, and I can't help but worry that you've spent 9 months telling us that we're an excellent service, and we haven't done this because we're worried about reputational damage. I can't get away from that feeling that my second point is, okay, so you disagree, that's fine. But Jasvinder has said at least 3 times the council won't share the rationale for the particular case. And I'm not really, the particular case is shocking in itself, but how can the independent chair be satisfied if they don't know the reasons why the lead authority won't give her the reasons why you are different to the other 3 partners, and I include the independent chair as a partner. So I wonder whether, Sal, you can at least make the board aware of why you haven't shared the rationale, and whether that's common. Secondly, this system has been in place over 2 years. There are children at risk. I can't sit here and listen to people say we need time to get it right. We have to get it right quickly because children are at risk. And 2 years in, since introducing it in September 19, it's a poor reason, I won't call it an excuse, to say that we're still working through the process. We should have that process. It should be a priority. We're a child-friendly city. And safeguarding our children and young people is our primary aim, first and foremost. And lastly, in hindsight, would you do anything differently?
Okay, so I think in terms of children at risk, I've already outlined that there are large numbers of children that we are working with every single day of the week. So this isn't about us not being involved in supporting or protecting children. We work with 5,800 children at any given time, either children in need, children who are subject to a child protection plan, or children who are in the care of the local authority. So this is a matter about a notification of incidents. It's not about the fact that we're not involved or trying to support children. And as I've said already, there's a range of learning that stems from those cases that are notified, but also in the figures that you heard before, there are a number of cases where we are undertaking learning where notifications haven't been made. Without getting into the specifics of the one, the earlier incident, I mean, I think there's something about the context of the time over which those matters came to light and how those decisions were made. I have considered, since I was made aware last week of what was in the public domain and what's come out of the criminal trial, that is a reconsideration for me, and we are continuing to be in dialogue with the national panel. As I say, there's a child practice review that has been agreed that is being undertaken in that matter.
Julie?
Yeah, just to come back on the point in relation to rationale, Jasvinder said that we're currently reviewing the notification process, which we are, but last year, on the back of discussions around the initial matter that was discussed this morning, we have agreed a process whereby at the earliest opportunity where either the local authority is considering that there may be a need for a notification, or whereby a partner feels that there is a situation, a serious incident that needs to be discussed, that happens, and that happens in a very timely manner. I have an immediate contact with Jasvinder. I make Jasvinder aware We then share information with the partners immediately so that the partners can contribute to the very initial discussions about individual matters, and can also share information in order to inform the decision making. In the event where we feel, after all of that collaboration, that discussion, the sharing of information, the reviewing of that information, that the criteria for notification has not been met, and it is a professional judgment, and it is a serious responsibility to apply the criteria correctly. We do give a rationale, so that is now in place, and that's a written rationale. And that's been in place since last year on the back of some of these conversations.
Thank you. Councillor Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question each for Councillor Venner, Sal and Julie. But before that, I think it'd be helpful that, Rebecca, you were going to come back on a description of serious harm, and that might assist with the answers to my questions.
Yeah, forgive me, I'd overlooked that. So do you have that for us now, Rebecca? Yeah, thank you.
I do indeed. Thank you very much, Councillor Stevenson. And the committee will also have heard Jasvinder refer to the definition expanded upon from working together, but the statutory definition as contained within the Children Act is serious harm includes serious or long-term impairment of mental health or intellectual, emotional, social or behavioural development. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Rebecca. Councillor Venner, notwithstanding your comments earlier, from a policy point of view, not going into any specific cases, from what we've just heard, do you therefore agree that in any case where there is child protection involved and there is a case of serious child sexual exploitation, there should always be a notification to the National Board for an independent review?
I don't think you can answer a question in that generalised term. I think, as Sal's highlighted, Annie Hudson herself, the chair of the national panel, has said it's a subjective decision in every case. So I'm not prepared to answer those kind of a theoretical, hypothetical questions.
It's not theoretical because it's in statute.
Right.
So it's very clear what serious harm is written in statute. We just heard from Rebecca what it is. And my question was therefore, regardless of whether the subjective nature of the case, do you agree that the principle that every case where there is serious child sexual exploitation with child protection already involved should be referred to the National Board for an independent view?
I wouldn't make that decision myself. I mean, it's Sal's decision for a start, who has the professional expertise.
So,
I'm not going to answer your question, Councillor Stevens.
Well, you're responsible for policy, Councillor Venner, and you're responsible for holding the officers to account. And that's why I'm asking my question. It's important for the Scrutiny Board to know what your view is as the person responsible for the executive portfolio.
My view is that each case needs to be considered in the multi-agency way that it is, whether there's a need to be notification or not. I do not make that decision. I will never make that decision. The decision is made, the decision is notified by the Director of Children's Services after they have had a conversation with the statutory partners, which are the police and health. That's my response.
I think the board can make of that what they wish, Chair. The reason for asking that is because when Ofsted came to do their front door review, one of the things that they raised was, to paraphrase effectively, an issue where children's services were marking their own homework, and that came in through the process of audit reviews. And again, to paraphrase, Ofsted suggested that there needs to be more of an independent view on audits. And I think that's important because what we've heard is that there are multiple ways to review a case, and I don't disagree with that. There are. The importance of a national notification review, though, is that it's not Leeds marking its own homework. It's an independent view at a national level to see what lessons can be learned, not just in Leeds, but across the whole country where cases occur. I think that's why it's very important that the National Review notification is reconsidered, as Jasvinder has said. My next question is to Julie. Sorry to put you on the spot, Julie, but linked to what I've just said about Ofsted, at the last Scrutiny Board meeting, we discussed the fact that the police and health are only present at 7 out of 10 meetings at present of serious safeguarding reviews. And in that meeting, I've just got the transcript. I asked a specific question, which was in terms of the meetings themselves, what would happen if there was disagreement? Say, for example, if the police thought further action needed to be taken, but the local authority or other partners felt that they didn't, who gets the final say on the decision? Julie, your response to me was that more often than not, there is consensus. And you said, we do have a resolutions process which sits with the Safeguarding Children's Partnership. So if at any point any partner in the city is not satisfied or does not have concern about any agency in terms of their response, then this is a process that can be initiated. It's very, very rare because actually we do have good partnerships in Leeds, and actually we are able to respect each other's professional judgment and reach a consensus, end quote. Given all that we've discussed today, I won't ask you if you want to retract the statement you gave to me last time, but would you agree that the resolution process clearly isn't as fit for purpose as the impression was given to us last time?
I'm happy to respond to Councillor Stevenson. I recall that your specific question at that meeting related to strategy discussions, which is a separate issue, a separate process to notification. So when you asked me I think you asked me whether there was disagreements within strategy discussions, if the 3 key partners involved in strategy discussions had a difference of opinion or didn't agree, what the outcome of that was. And my response related to strategy discussions, that actually, often in strategy discussions, we do debate information, we do share information. The resolutions process is there in relation to strategy discussions, and it is not something that is utilised in relation to strategy discussions or the quality of strategy discussions to a high extent. So I suppose I just want to be clear that you asked me a particular question in relation to strategy discussions, and I responded in relation to strategy discussions, not in relation to notifications.
Yeah, no, thank you, Julie. That's a fair point. Thank you. I'll clarify that. In terms of the reaching consensus point, then, when we get to a situation, as Tony's expressed, where 2 out of 3 partners have a disagreement, do we think, and anybody can answer this, that there is a case for us as a council to be making representations to ministers alongside Jasvinder to make the case that it shouldn't be a decision held just with the local authority? It should be what Jasvinder argued for earlier, that the board itself can make a collective view together.
That is what it was used to be, and it was changed. So I think, given none of us have the detailed knowledge of why that was, I think you'd need to look back at why the Alan Wood Review suggested that change and why they felt that the decision needs to be in one of the bodies, and the body that was selected was the local authority, which, as I said earlier, rests the responsibility in social work. So I think you'd need to go back and look at why that decision making was made, because it used to be the joint responsibility of all 3 partners, and it isn't now.
Do you think it should be, Councillor Venner?
I honestly don't know.
And a final question, Chair. Careful, Howard. Sal, given what we've heard today, and given that Jasvinder has suggested that a retrospective notification should be made about at least one case, Will you give a commitment to Scrutiny Board that you will go away and discuss that with Jasvinder and take that request seriously?
I do take all of these matters very seriously, Councillor Stevens, and I hope that you know that. And yes, I will.
Can I also add, it was mentioned earlier that we are having a further discussion about the case with Annie Hudson. We've sat about a process where we're getting an external opinion on that process of decision making from the chair of the national panel.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Carter next. I've got two other speakers. I'm very conscious of the time. I don't want to stifle the debate, but we do shortly need to wrap up and consider what next steps we want to take. There are two recommendations in the paper, but we do need to move things along. So if I can bring Councillor Carter in, please.
Thank you. This is my first time at this panel, so it's been a lot for me to get my head around. However, I have had a lot of casework involving children's services, and in my role on the Police and Crime Panel, I meet regularly with the Chief Superintendent, who has raised concerns about the way children's services are handling reviews with me. And there's lots of things I don't understand. I can never understand why perpetrators are allowed to, on the recommendations of children's services, get their clutches and are allowed to look after children, even though they've committed a crime against children, against an adult, and it could be a sexual violent crime. So there's lots of things I don't understand, but perhaps you could clarify this for me. In terms of notifications to Leeds compared to other authorities, do we have any information as to what other authorities in West Yorkshire have brought forward for notification?
I think, Rebecca, did you have that available?
Thank you, Chair. Yes.
Do you need a minute or two?
I do have that information, and I do know that that information is being collected also within the review of the notification process that the committee has been referred to today, and as well as local information. Information is also being requested of other core cities. With me, I beg your pardon. So I can confirm that the information collected from our counterparts in West Yorkshire was collected through information contained within their annual reports. So for instance, I can confirm that for Bradford, between 2019 to 2020, they made 5, or rather they had 5 rapid reviews, and from 2020 to 21, they had 7. Wakefield in the similar periods of 19 and 20 had 5, and in Wakefield, in 2020 to 21, they had 4, 3 of which involved child deaths. Kirklees had, in the period 2019 to 24, and no data reported yet for 2021. And Calderdale reported no information for both of those 2 years.
Okay, and did you say that that information will be part of the review?
Yes, certainly. I'm aware that the terms of reference include a gathering of benchmarking information.
Okay, thank you. So I've got 2 more contributors. Councillor Illingworth, please.
Yeah, I listened to this debate, and I don't think anybody's explained to us what the advantages of the present arrangements are. Obviously, it was done for a reason, and you can't speak about individual cases, but could you just outline why we do it this way and what the benefits are?
John, it's a national change of legislation, So pre-2019, it was the equal responsibility of all three partners to make a decision about notifying, and the legislation changed nationally and vested the responsibility with the local authority. So although all three partners have a statutory joint responsibility for safeguarding children, in legislation, it's the responsibility of the local authority to do the notification. And I guess as Sal said, the way the system used to be previously, it was leading to a lot of reviews that were very repetitive. And Rebecca inferred earlier, it may have been considered that it would be more beneficial to have that decision made by one party rather than all three trying to come to a consensus view now. Whether that's the right decision or not, we've been debating today. It's not our decision to do it that way as a council. It's what's set out in legislation, that the responsibility to notify is with the local authority.
Thank you. Jasvinda wanted to come in as well.
Okay.
Councillor Linwood.
Thank you, Chair. The first thing I will say is that I actually welcome the system of rapid reviews. The advantage is that you do have that conversation between partners at the table to have conversations about the most serious cases. The important word here is collaboration, and it is about us using our judgment. And with all due respect, and I take on board the views Councillor Venner made about peer advice and, children's services or their professional views, but we take on board the professional views of all our partners. These are people in their professional capacity that sit around a review advisory group, very experienced people in this space. We consider all the views. So actually, Annie Hudson would make the point that rapid reviews is about rapid learning. It's about the city looking at cases that meet the criteria for a notification and learning very quickly. And I take on the point that we do have other avenues of learning and we do consider that, but it's not rapid learning. It is, that in terms of if it meets the threshold, then we want to learn quickly and we want to learn fast. And going back to Councillor Stevenson's point, my view is if the case meets the criteria of serious harm, then surely it should be notified. That's my view. But the conversations around the partnership table at the review advisory group are based on scoping, are based on evidence, and are based on, does this meet the criteria of all partners? We have that conversation in depth, it's all minuted. And what I would like to understand is, in terms of that collaboration, is that I'm hearing it's a new system, but the system is clear. We're very clear about the system. But I think where we need to do more work is the views of all partners in this space and the considerations of all partners need to be considered. And that includes if the executive board, if I take something to my executive board where I'm feeling that there needs to be another view because they haven't reached that consensus because of a disagreement at the review advisory group, these are experts in their field, very senior people who are having that conversation. And if at that level there is still disagreement, then I'm pleased to hear that Sal is going to reflect. He's made the point that he's pleased to hear that you may consider retrospective notification, because that's what I'm asking for, because it's okay to look at the case and reflect. But where partners are being very clear and giving the evidence, it's evidence-based, and can evidence that, then surely there should be consideration for that. And may I also say that, Councillor Venner, I absolutely, regardless of my passion, I absolutely see the passion of people across the city in taking care of children and the most vulnerable children. What I'm asking for is for all partners to have a level conversation to be considered in the same way, regardless of that duty placed on the local authority.
Okay, thank you. Celia, please.
Thank you, Chair. A lot of discussion, and it seems to be about things that I didn't think we were being asked to discuss, to consider, because a new system, because an old system didn't seem to work, is not within our sphere of influence. The operation of children's services being questioned, I didn't think that was in our sphere of this meeting. I thought we were here, and it might be Rebecca that can answer this, is because our chair, Councillor Lamb, was not informed about this refusal to have a rapid review. So basically, I'd like to ask, under what circumstances should the chair of Scrutiny Board, Children and Young People, be informed of the cases that the Leeds Safeguarding Children's Partnership are being asked to consider, and under these specific circumstances?
If I answer that bit for myself first, then Rebecca will come in. My view. Yeah. Well, sorry. Yeah. My view is the order of events, and as I see it, the independent chair of the Safeguarding Partnership has raised serious concerns with the council about the process of notification, not the system, the way it's being implemented in Leeds. And my view as chair, it's not set down, it's a matter of judgment for the director and the executive member, what they bring to me and therefore to the board. They chose not to, and I think they were wrong. And it goes to the wider point, and there's two issues which I was going to raise at the end, which I feel have been skirted round, that we can only do our job as a scrutiny board effectively based on what we know. And we rely on the executive member and the director telling us pretty much everything, good and bad, so that we can then decide how to support them as a critical friend in making improvements and in the interests of children. And the other issue, which I feel has been skirted around a little bit in the responses, is I feel one of the key points Jasvinder was making is there is an awful lot in these cases that we don't know. It relies on partners being informed that there is a case that they might consider warrants a notification. And the answer to one of my questions earlier was, we don't know how many other cases there are. There could be many, and we're not potentially learning the lessons. And that to me is what we're looking at. We have just touched on a lot of issues which are useful context, but for me, those are the key issues that we've been looking at. And Rebecca, I don't know if you...
Is it okay if I come back in, Councillor Lamb, just on 2 points, just in relation to Jasvinder's comments about collaboration and the importance of information sharing and professional respect. You know, having an open, healthy culture, you know, is all about respecting different expertise. And certainly it is my view that we do that. And in the conversations that I have had with police colleagues, with health colleagues, with the LSCP, when we've pulled information from all the partners, we've reviewed that, we've discussed it, we've debated it, we've taken legal advice, we've taken advice from other directors, other local authorities, and we've looked at that in the round, because as it currently stands, and as others have said, it's out with our control at the moment. As it currently stands, that is our responsibility, that is our duty. And we have to have professional judgment and professional integrity when we make those decisions. I think the issue that we have had, as has been discussed this morning, is on the occasion when there's disagreement. One of the things I wanted to say, just to make clear, that within the current review that's going on in relation to the notification process, we have all recognised that as something that we need to look at. So, what, I suppose, as part of that review, what do we do when there is disagreement? Because ultimately, it is the responsibility of children and families to make that decision. And we must do that using our professional judgment, taking into account all of the information, all of the views from partners. But we have to maintain our professional integrity and judgment at the same time. Just in relation, I suppose, to key partners not being aware. Whenever there is a serious incident in the city, whenever a child suffers serious or significant harm, there is a strategy discussion, and that strategy discussion involves health, police and children's social work. So at the earliest opportunity, information about serious incidents, serious harm, significant harm is shared and is known by the 3 key statutory bodies. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a final comment from Councillor Carter, and then I'm going to ask for responses on that. And I'm going to ask after that, Sal, Councillor Venner, Julie, and then Jasvinder to give us their view on what the next steps should be for the board. And we can agree if we think that's the appropriate things or if anyone's got any other suggestions. So Councillor Carter, please.
In the Rotherham inquiry, the inspector said that the local authority had been more concerned about their reputational damage. And I wonder if, well, the law is very clear that children's services have the last word on calling a review. But I wonder, Chair, if we didn't ought to try to take this nationally so that all partners have the ability to call in a review, because clearly they have a lot of value to add to the case, and equally so, I would imagine, as children's services. I wonder if we could possibly take that with the agreement of the board to a national level.
Thank you. So if I just go in order, please, and if anyone's got a comment on Councillor Carter's suggestion, that would be helpful. But we have recommendations, which is first and foremost that we have considered the information presented, and I think we absolutely would want, unless I see any dissenters, an in-depth update once the review work has concluded. I think everyone's agreeing with that. We then determine what other further scrutiny activity is required. So I'd really welcome Sal's, Councillor Venner's, Julie's and Jasvinder's view on that in that order. So Sal, if I can start with you, please.
I mean, I think the first bit is the bit for us to complete initially, which is complete the review and bring a further in-depth report, because I think setting out this in a way that can help people not confuse different processes, because I think there is a little bit of that happening, so that people do understand which part of the system we're talking about and what that means. So I think if we can bring that back in the first instance and then consider a further action at that point. As I say, we are continuing dialogue nationally as well, so that will feed into the review that we're undertaking.
Councillor Bennett.
I don't have much to add to that, Chair. I'm very happy to bring back the review report to discuss that further with you when that's completed. And as we've referred to several times, we have Annie Hudson directly involved with us in Leeds. We've sought her opinion on a specific case, but we're also discussing at a national level the national implications of some of the challenges that we're having around the partnership and the way decision making happens at the moment. But I think, as Sal said, I appreciate it's been really challenging for you today because you've had information given to you at the last minute that's not very comprehensive, and we will be able to bring you a fuller report where we can have a more in-depth discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. Julie, please.
I don't really have anything much to add other than I think as has been explained this morning, changes have already been put in place ahead of the outcome of the current review. So I think I've already referenced the fact that when a serious incident happens where we are considering that notification may be necessary, that I contact Jasvinder immediately, and then there's a process followed, etc. I just wondered that it might be helpful for us to outline some of the changes that we have made in the interim through our discussions with partners and in agreement with partners.
Thank you. And Jasvinder, I'd really welcome any views that you have on next steps that scrutiny should take.
The first thing to note is that the review should be completed by the end of March. The police have invested time and capacity in that, and health, and I understand social care are identifying a person to also contribute at least 1 or 2 days a week towards that review. Because there are limitations in terms of what we can achieve. And so we do need that capacity to do that. the other thing I would say is I do support advocating things nationally. However, other areas do agree locally on a partnership level to agree notifications collectively. And I do think we need to be working in the here and now, because I'm mindful of the fact that anything you advocate nationally for changes in legislation takes time. And what we need to understand is I don't want to be in this position where partners are presenting their cases and opinions and professional judgment, and we land in a space where they believe it's met the threshold, they believe it's met the criteria, and then that isn't considered for rapid review. So I feel there's something that has to change in the here and now. That's my view.
Okay, thank you, Jasvinder. So
just make 2 points on that, if that's okay. Just that our principal social worker has already met with police colleagues and is involved in the review that is being undertaken, and a number of us have also spoken to the lead person from the police. I think whilst Jasvinder's point about there being a tripartite arrangement elsewhere, I think you're referring to within the region. My understanding is that it is still very clear that the decision is made by the Director of Children's Services in that authority, who I've spoken to about it, and they don't have they have also gone down a path of not having an independent chair. So that's not where we are at, and so there will be differences in local areas, but the legislation and the final decision on those matters does rest with the local authority.
okay, so in terms of next steps for the board, I think the key next step is that we wait for the review to be completed and report back to us. Councillor Gruen.
This is an attempt to be constructive and helpful in terms of next steps. For me, the one part of this morning's debate that's been missing is to fully understand the rationale for the local authority's decision. And quite understandably, you felt that you can't share that because it would be case specific, and that's not appropriate. And I completely accept that. But if in the next paper that comes, or in the next meeting we have, you could think about describing that in generic terms. So, for example, you must have considered a number of criteria, and perhaps you've put much greater weight on one than the others for specific reasons, case-specific reasons, and that might have influenced your decision to not do a notification. I think that's the bit of the rationale we haven't understood, and I think if we did understand it, we perhaps would feel a lot more comfortable than we do. And so my suggestion is that you try and find a way, Sal, of describing that without it being case specific, so that we understand the quality and depth of the process the local authority went through. I think Julie was making reference to that, but it was so generic, I'm not sure that we quite hung on to those hooks. But we need to understand the complexity and the seriousness with which it was considered by the local authority.
Happy to do that.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Councillor Stevenson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just looking to that second recommendation, what further scrutiny activity is required, I think what sticking in my mind from this morning is that and this goes to Councillor Gruen's point actually, that whether or not we are presented with the full information of the case, or in generic terms or otherwise, it's not our job as a scrutiny board to almost review those individual cases. The fact is that the independent children's safeguarding chair, whose arguably job it is, has raised these concerns with us, and we cannot miss that point in our deliberations this morning. It is a very serious thing, and in the 5 years I've been on council, I've never seen anything like that happen before, in terms of, I was going to use the word whistleblowing earlier, and it clearly isn't, but it's got a whiff of that, in a sense that somebody's bringing a concern to us from within in terms of what's happening. And I think that what we can't miss moving forward is that issue about whether it is appropriate that the legislation changed so that just a local authority has the decision-making role. And Jasvinder's given us her view, her professional view on how that should work. Councillor Venner didn't have an opinion on it. I'm quite clear, I think, from what I've heard, and the Wood Review in 2016 was around child deaths, and from what I've heard this morning, I have a view that I think it's probably sensible. I agree with Jasvinder's view, and the government probably got it wrong when they made that change. So I wonder, once the review's out, whether there is an opportunity for this scrutiny board to meet with scrutiny boards in other core cities, and perhaps have a dialogue with the Commons Select Committee as well around whether we feel representations collectively need to be made to government as to why it is the view of our independent chair that it's not working as it should be, and whether that's just something that's going wrong here in Leeds, or whether other local authorities are having the same view. And if that is the case, then we almost need to come together and lobby higher up as one body collectively. And I think everybody else in the panel might disagree, that's my view, they might disagree. But when this review comes back, I think we need to have that conversation about whether that is a route that we should take as a scrutiny board.
Okay, thank you. So is everybody agreed that the next step is to hear that report with the suggestions Councillor Gruen has made, and to really keep a strong watching brief on this? And I personally cannot get away from the fact that the independent chair of the Safeguarding Children's Partnership has raised serious concerns about how this issue is working in Leeds. And that didn't come to us, and it should have, and people need to reflect on that as well as a step to make sure we retain confidence that we are getting all of the information that we need to be able to scrutinise properly. So on that basis, is everyone happy that that is the outcome of the meeting, that we're going to get the review and then we'll decide what further action, but we will keep a watching brief? I would suggest when we have that review, we invite all of the partners to the table to share their view of it. So that would be Jasvinder as the chair, the police partner and the health partner. And I think it would be useful to hear all of those views if everyone's agreeable. Jasvinder.
Chair, I would find that really helpful, because I'm mindful of the fact that two executive board members are not representative here from the police and health, albeit I did have conversations with them yesterday. I do think it's important that they are representative at future meetings.
Thank you. We will do our best to make sure that happens. So first, I appreciate this has taken a lot of time. I still believe, just as I did at the start of the meeting and last week, that it was essential that this came to scrutiny at the earliest opportunity. And I think we've done the issue as much justice as we can with the information we've got now. So I thank everybody who's taken part. I particularly thank Jasvinder for taking the time and for the work that she's doing in her role. And we're really grateful to her for coming to share her concerns with us this morning. In terms of the rest of the agenda, I'm going to suggest, I appreciate the time is later than we normally would. I'm determined that we take the future in mind strategy. Item 7, I will propose that we defer all the other items except for the work schedule and date and time of next meeting. But I'm sure I'm not the only person who would benefit from a comfort break at this precise moment. But if I can encourage people to be back in 5 minutes so we can get going and turn the microphones off so the webcast doesn't pick it up. Thank you.
Everyone.
Starting. Okay, welcome back, everybody. If everyone could take their seats, please. I've been generous with the 5 minutes already, so we will get started. We're moving on to item 7, which is Future in Mind Leeds Strategy Update. In November 2020, the board will recall they were given the opportunity to input into the development of the refreshed Future in Mind strategy prior to it being approved by the Health and Wellbeing Board in April 2021. We were keen to continue monitoring the implementation of this refreshed strategy, and therefore the Leeds Clinical Commissioning Group has led on providing an update to the board which sets out the current and future work being undertaken that's linked to the strategy and aims to drive forward improvement in terms of children and young people's outcomes. Just to explain, I'm not sure if everybody on the board is aware that a full Ofsted inspection will begin in the city next Monday. And as such, you can imagine Sal's and Julie's commitments are quite stretched at the moment. So I'm grateful for the time they've given. They did advise me at the start that they'd struggle to stay beyond this time, so that's why they've left. But we're in safe hands, I feel, anyway, with those that are left. So we know Councillor Venner anyway, but perhaps if I could ask Jane Bathgate Roche to introduce herself, and Emily Griffiths, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Jane Bathgate Roach. I'm a Pathway Integration Leader at NHS Leeds Clinical Commissioning Group in the Children and Families team.
Thank you. My name is Emily Griffiths. I'm Associate Director of Pathway Integration. Jane works in my team in relation to children's, and my portfolios are children, families, and the mostly healthy adult population.
Thank you. So can I ask Councillor Venner if you have any introductory comments, please?
Yeah, thank you. So I was just eating a biscuit. Thank you for the biscuits as well. I'm always really happy to introduce the Future in Mind. As most people know, it's mental health is my particular area of interest, and I'm really proud that I set up some of the services that are referred to that were set up under this this strategy in my previous role, and I now chair the Future in Mind board, which is a great privilege. And the strategy was refreshed last year, which was really timely because it meant we could do it in the context of COVID, which we know has had a really massive impact on children and young people's mental health and well-being. And it also references the impact of trauma, the impact of poverty. It links us to the work that's happening in the city and regionally around trauma. It's a strategy, it's not just a mental health strategy, it's about children's mental health and well-being in its widest sense. And there's links between Future in Mind and the all-age mental health strategy and the Adult Mental Health Partnership Board. And we have some joint priorities. So transition between children's services and adult services is a priority for both boards, and the work around trauma is a priority for both boards. And we agreed that after the strategy was refreshed last year, that we would then bring it back a number of months later, which is what we're doing today. So they're my introductory comments. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Venner. So I understand Jane's going to give a brief introduction to the report, and then we'll go into questions and comments.
Thank you. I might just give an overview to the committee first, if I may. So the report in its broadest sense is to, as Councillor Venner has said, note and recognise the developments under the strategy. We also really want to highlight the strength of the partnership working in developing this strategy, which stretches across health services, education, council services and the third sector, and thank those involved for their continued commitment during this time. The recommendations of the report focus on the way in which we can embed a think family approach in the city across all professional groups, and developing a system-wide response within the city to children and young people who have experienced trauma. We also want to highlight the previous lack of parity in investment in children and young people's mental health, and we hope to connect this work to the work of the Children's Population Board in the city, which will have its first meeting in March to redress that disparity. We're also focusing on transforming services, particularly those relating to adolescents and young people who are approaching adulthood. And we need to work together to address the health inequalities which have been particularly exposed and widened in the last few years. For example, looking at those impacts on children who live in poverty and have experienced trauma, have special educational needs, or who are looked after in our care system. I'm going to hand over to Jane to talk about some of the specific developments, which are quite exciting, and the ways in which we are trying to respond to the COVID impacts to maintain that positive work.
Thank you, and Councillor Venner and Emily have done an excellent overview for me of the paper. So I'll just talk briefly about some of the areas of development that sit within the strategy, particularly in relation to our 7 priority areas that yourselves as a board had a hand in developing almost a year ago. There's some really great pieces of work that have been happening, as Emily said, as a partnership across these areas. Each of the work streams that are detailed within the report are led by a different partner agency, working with a multi-agency group of professionals in order to lead some of this work forward. So just to pick up on some of the key points that are detailed, obviously we have a strong focus on prevention that's led by our public health colleagues, but with other services represented around the table, really thinking about how can we promote positive mental health and wellbeing and reduce stigma across all our services and provide that level of support for our children and young people. I'm not going to go into too much detail into each of these because you've got the report, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. One of our biggest areas of priority is around about support. It always feels like quite a short paragraph, but there's a lot in there in terms of driving down waiting times, increasing access, and ensuring children and young people have the right support at the right time in the place where they would need it the most. We have been over the last year developing, in response to the pandemic as well, a number of new service offers, particularly around about that early intervention level. So looking at how we work with our cluster providers and ensuring that there's additional capacity within those services to support children and young people at that lower level, looking at how we can bring our professionals together. We're in the midst of delivering a link programme, which is jointly a piece of joint work with the Anna Freud Centre and the Department of Education to look at how we bring mental health practitioners and school staff together and work on some of those challenges that they define collectively. There have been some really great conversations about actually communication is key here and how we bring those opportunities for people to work better together to understand the wide-ranging services that we have across Leeds. We've also, as Emily said, look at how we reduce that parity in terms of the difference in investment that comes in for children's mental health. And we've been really successful in securing additional funding through the Transforming Children and Young People's Mental Health Provision Green Paper and the Trailblazers around the mental health support teams. And I know that you've been updated on those before in terms of the teams that we have in place within our further education settings to provide that earlier level of mental health support for children and young people. But we've managed to secure an additional 6 teams that will launch across Leeds, working alongside our cluster teams in the secondary and primary schools to really provide that additional support to children and young people and their families when they need it the most. I think it's Councillor Venner and Emily have both said as well about really that joint piece of work with partners from an all-age mental health strategy point of view, particularly around about the transitions programme of work. And I'm absolutely delighted that it's been approved as a priority from both Future in Mind and from our all-age mental health strategy. And we've got some massive amount of practitioners really working together to look at where are those arbitrary cut-offs between services that we need to break down to allow children and young people to move between services, taking into account their needs will change as their age changes as well. Also within the report, there's some key areas about some developments that we've got happening. So the delivery of our digital therapeutic platform, Silver Cloud, which is currently available in some of the clusters within Leeds. We're rolling that out now across all of them so that there's that lower level digital support with a support worker for young people where that meets their needs. We're also got a bit of a watching brief just to let you know about a piece of work we're really interested in looking at both within Leeds and across West Yorkshire about the need to develop a service that supports children with medically unexplained symptoms, chronic fatigue and the symptoms of long COVID. So looking at how we bring that physical and mental health together. So I think that's a really exciting development that we're looking to do some work around about. Just sort of the last points, we've touched on trauma, and I think everyone is aware of that really key piece of work that's happening across the city, both in terms of the development of the service, but also the movement for everybody to start to think trauma across all of our services and that real recognition of the importance of think family and work family. The last 2 areas, parent carer and family support and health inequalities, in their own right are priority areas, but are actually the golden thread that goes through all our priority work streams. And we're doing a lot of work to think about as a child starts to require some level of support, what support have we got for their parents? What support have we got for the siblings in that family? How can we equip them to support the young person? And health inequalities, you'll have heard before when Jane presented this previously about our social, emotional and mental health needs assessment about children and young people from Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities. We've started to develop some really key pieces of work around about that with the development of community grants. We have our mental health ethnic inequalities lead for children and young people employed by Forum Central that really is key to having that voice and making all our services aware of those challenges that we face across the city for our different communities. So quick overview of the service, of the strategy, and happy to take absolutely any questions that you might have in relation to that.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. So I've got Celia to kick off, please, and I'm seeing other hands going up.
Thank you, Chair. Interesting report, and in several places, understandably, it refers to schools and their involvement, clusters, and then the improving mental health provision in schools. And I am aware, as someone who works at representing school staff, of various schools in the city that are experiencing troublesome behaviour manifesting itself in several ways in the schools. Not all of these schools are run by the local authority. Not all of them will be in clusters. Are you optimistic that all schools and therefore all children will benefit from this programme? And can I just add on, is there any more money for CAMS?
Thank you for your questions. In terms of the schools, I think there is a challenge about those schools who are not in cluster and who are not part of this system. And we have possibly daily conversations about how do we improve this? How do we make a difference? How do we ensure that those schools who have chosen to provide that offer themselves are very much aware of what else is out there? And that's a live conversation. We've not got it right yet. And I know we are talking to our primary care network colleagues as well, who many of them are really interested at looking at those who are within their localities, so the local care partnerships. How can we bring all schools together, not just those that are in the cluster module? And I've got a meeting in a couple of weeks to start to talk about some of that as well, because there is that acknowledgement that there is a gap. And for schools and for primary care colleagues, it's a challenge as well, because we're investing in this system of work. And so acknowledgement that it isn't right, but we are doing something to look at it. And what we're also doing, as I mentioned, the LINK programme, which we've put that offer to all schools to come together with our mental health practitioners to build up that network, because there's a recognition that people will go to the service that they know, that perhaps might not even be a commissioned service, but it's the one they know. So how do we bring that better together and look at our MindMate website as a bit of a profession, look at developing that site with professionals to get a more professionals network up and running, so we can get information out there, which seems to be the key as I'm starting to speak to more and more professionals. So I think there's some good things starting, but actually absolutely acknowledge that comment about the challenges between those. And we're also trying to have conversations with those services that those schools that are not within cluster are commissioning, and how do we bring them into those discussions. In terms of funding for CAMS, I was expecting that question today. There's a lot of development happening within CAMS. Obviously, we know the pandemic has had an impact on the demand and acuity of children and young people's mental health presentations. There's been additional investment made across a number of services this year in terms of support for children and young people with eating disorders. So the CAMS eating disorders team has been expanded. The CAMS transition team has been expanded. There's been a lot of investment put into the neurodevelopmental assessments. We know the numbers for autism assessments are sort of going up 3 times. They're significantly increasing. So we're looking at how there's an additional investment to support that in the here and now, but how do we work as a system to collectively change how we support children and young people with autism and ADHD? There's also been additional investment into our CAMS crisis line in terms of that point of contact for children, young people, families, professionals, when they feel that there's a mental health crisis, which is also working alongside our voluntary sector organisations, so Teen Connect and the West Yorkshire Response Night Owls, to support, to have that additional point of contact, so that there has been additional investments, and we will continue to push for more as we move forward with some of these developments that's mentioned in the report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got Councillor Carter next, please.
Oh, thank you. This is an exciting piece of work, and it's very welcome. Thank you for all your hard work with that. One thing that we know is evidence that early intervention, in fact, almost immediate intervention after a trauma, is really important for mental health. And are you able to build in that ability to act almost immediately? I mean, sometimes it can be such a simple intervention as getting the child just to talk about what has happened. That can be enough to stem further mental health issues, I'm sure you know. Thank you.
I think that's why it's so important that trauma is a priority within this strategy and also in the all-age mental health strategy. And it's also something that's recognised across the city. We've got more and more professionals at different levels engaging with that programme of work, so we can look at people being aware of that as well, rather than, you know, looking at the behaviour, what's behind the behaviour. And I think that's why the trauma movement, if you like, is so important, so that people can have that early level conversation, but understand why they need to have that early conversation, and then look at the other developments in terms of the trauma service and the trauma strategy that will come out that will address exactly what you've raised there about having that earlier conversation. I don't know if that answers your question.
If I could just add one really positive example in the last year has been the development of trauma navigator roles in the A&E departments. So the strategic approach that we're trying to take as a health service now is very different. We've previously organised ourselves around services. So someone's managed A&E and commissioned for A&E. Someone has managed a particular mental health service and commissioned for that health service. And the Think Child and Think Family approach, which Councillor Venner and partners are advocating, means that we're now trying to think about the experience of the child. So these A&E navigators are there at a point where a young person has experienced trauma, usually in relation to violent crime, and are able to train other ED staff and signpost that young person into appropriate services as needed. But as you say, have that important conversation at the time at which it's most likely to be successful as an intervention. So those are the kind of things that we'd like to build on and develop as we measure the efficacy of that model.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Renshaw, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask a couple of questions that I'd already got written down before Celia had asked them. One of them is about the time scale of CAMHS and the length of time that a child has to wait before they even get referred to CAMHS. So it's going through that whole process, and I'd just like to know what that time scale is now, because I think the mental health is really key to a lot of children and young people's lifestyles. Also, some of the young people who are just beginning to start school, so the early years, have had no experience of social skills, social interaction. The parents haven't. And so there's a whole book full of sort of casework that's ongoing within educational establishments. And I just wondered if you'd any plans to address those in the early years so that it feeds through school better. And the youth service wasn't really mentioned, or I didn't hear it anyway, but I understand that if you're a qualified youth worker, you only get an 18.5-hour job offer. So the mental health issues that lots of young people are going through are dealt with through the youth service. So I wondered if there was any plans to put those in place and to get the people to fill those vacancies who are appropriately trained. And I think there was a last one, let me think. And then the clusters in areas, you said that you're going to try and engage with schools that are not in clusters. In my ward, in the Morley side and Arsey and Tingley, Arsey and Tingley is no longer a cluster. And I don't think the Morley one is either, but Jane will clarify that one. I don't think the cluster exists in there anymore. So in the outer south, we're like a cluster-free zone on part of it. And I just wondered if you'd any plans that could address the issues within that area.
Okay, thank you. Lots of questions. I've been taking notes. Hope I covered them all. In terms of waiting times for services, if we look at before the pandemic and now, we can't compare like for like because so many things have happened. So we know at the very start of the pandemic, there was a lot of services that had to sort of stop, take stock and suddenly change their offer. So there was backlogs started to occur. So when we look at some of the waiting times, there might suddenly be a backlog and then suddenly boosh, they're into services because we've managed to support that. We've invested a lot in those services that we've spoken about before. So more money into clusters, more money into CAMHS, more money into some of those lower levels. Where we've got challenges is that single point of access and blockages happening at that point. The service have been hugely hampered by workforce issues. Funding in some of our services is not so much the issue, it's the workforce that's the issue. So we're having to do some quite radical thinking about how can we use the resources that we've got to attract more members of staff. Leeds Community Healthcare, who manage the My Mate single point of access, are doing some work with some of the providers across the city, so clusters, some of our third sector providers, to bring more capacity into the single point of access so that it's truly multi-agency. So it's not just CAMHS practitioners, it's truly multi-agency, so we can get the referrals to the right place at the right time without us having to go through a long process and going backwards and forwards for information, working with practitioners to ensure we've got the right information, so reviewing referral forms so the process is slick. We've got online self-referrals now for children, young people and their families can make a referral into the single point of access to speed up that as well as professionals doing that as well. So there's a lot of work to look at how do we move children and young people through that system faster, and bearing in mind the challenges that we've had through the pandemic with all the workforce issues and all the, as you say, children, young people perhaps not being at school. Home was a safe environment for children and young people who are perhaps struggling at school, and then when they move back to school, there's the challenges there. So I haven't got the waiting times as it is, because I don't think it would probably tell you anything at this point now. If you want that, I can speak to colleagues in Leeds Community Health Care. I can share that through Angela. I think that what I want to reassure you is there are pressures. We are aware of that, particularly at the single point of access end, and looking at how we really truly change that to become a multi-agency forum of work.
I mean, I do appreciate all these helplines that you put in the report, but a teenager or a young child in primary is not going to actually access when they actually are in that state of need. So I just wondered what there was.
To be fair, they do. I know that having set up Teen Connect, I mean, we did have to adapt it quite dramatically because we discovered that young people don't actually talk on the phone in the way that we did when we were younger. So it's delivered using text messaging and instant messaging more than it's delivered on the phone. But actually, those services that have been set up through this work stream have been hugely in demand over the pandemic. They are accessed by teenagers in need.
Thank you. I think on the back of Teen Connect as well, we do, because we are listening to what children and young people are telling us about how they want to access their services. So looking at that tech support, online support, how they can do that easier. We mentioned before about the funding that we've managed to secure for more mental health support teams working with schools across Leeds. So that will bring that more support for schools at that earlier level. The cluster offer, working with the clusters, providing additional funding. But for those that are not in a cluster, that's something, it's a difficult one to sort of influence. We work very closely with Leeds City Council and the early help offer to try and see how we can work better. We obviously commission the specialist mental health input to the clusters. So there's, as I was saying before, it's not perfect. We've got work to do about how, for example, your area of schools are not in a cluster, and how they have made that decision themselves to provide that level of support to their children and young people outside of a cluster model. So there is the challenge there about they've made that decision. They will still provide that level of intervention. They must provide that level of intervention, but they're doing it out with a system, and that's the challenge.
Thank you for that. I've got Councillor Illingworth next, please.
Yes, I want to look at page 28, sections 11.1, 11.2, and page 24, section 5.2, which are about health inequalities. And I don't know if colleagues are the same as me, to see press reports on outcomes and ethnicity in the press this week, really quite shocking differences in outcome, which really took me aback. And I thought it can't possibly be as big as that. But apparently they are. I was going to ask about this in the mental health context, that it appeared from other conditions that the outcomes in ethnic minority groups were substantially worse than white British population, to the point where we're not doing our job right, and we need to achieve better than this. I just wonder what your reactions are to the ethnic component of success rates.
I think you're absolutely right that the statistics that we're seeing highlighted in media now are devastating. However, it's something that the Health Service has been aware of for a number of years, and we've got the opportunity now to look at how we design services and deliver them, thinking about the person, or in this case, the child and their family and where they live. So instead of, as I talked about previously, thinking service and thinking, well, we provide a mental health service and 75% of our referrals are seen in time and those kind of statistics, so that's okay. Looking instead at the population of Leeds as individuals and as people and trying to measure that gap. So the work we will be doing in partnership for the Children's Population Board, which the Future in Mind Strategy Programme Board will be adopted underneath, will enable us to look at the population of Leeds in terms of children, in terms of where they live, in terms of vulnerable groups. So perhaps a child who's had contact with the care system, perhaps children who are from different cultural backgrounds, and compare their outcomes across the board. So rather than saying, well, we've achieved a statistical average here and that's acceptable because it meets a performance measure, instead commissioning for outcomes. And we hope by doing that, we will actually be able to shift funding across the system in health in a way that we've never done before. So it's always been a flatline provision across the city with some really targeted work through certain strategies, but this hopefully will fundamentally change the way we commission health services in the future to drive forwards improvements and close that gap. So we really do improve the health of people in the city who are the poorest the fastest, because that's what needs to happen. But absolutely acknowledge that Leeds does feature in those statistics in the same way as the rest of the country. There is a significant gap, and it's a gap we need to close.
Thank you, Councillor Bennett. The final point is to Councillor Lay, please.
Thank you. A good strategy document. It is a strategy document, though, so I wouldn't expect you to necessarily know about the current waiting times. That's operational. That will come in an annual report, probably. Good strategy document. Clearly, improvements being made. Access is improving. I can vouch for that as the father of a teenage son who gets access to MindMate and the marketplace as and when he needs it. Knows how to. My only slight reservation is, of course, it's all city centre delivered rather than Leeds being a huge metropolitan city, and there are major towns and cities that don't have access to this stuff, including Otley. You know, it would be much easier if there was a half a day in Otley a week for young people in Otley and Poole, etc., or in Wetherby if it was half a day in Wetherby, etc., if they were delivered closer to home. Because we know that we want care closer to home, and that counts for children as well. So good stuff going on. I want to ask about where the 6 teams are. I noticed Bramley in the West have got 2. I assume that's 2, but so there's 4 going elsewhere. You've talked about more investment across the services. Where is that money coming from? And finally, you talked about staffing and having a problem in finding healthcare professionals to deliver these services. At a regional level, do you have discussions with organisations like Health Education England? Because we know there's a 3-year lead for, and I'm a nurse, most people in this room know that we know there's a 3 or 4 year lead for us to get our nurses and get our mental health nurses, and yet my wife is a nurse lecturer over at the University of Leeds, hasn't got, well, she has got enough work, but she could have more work if we started training our own nurses. As it is, we're going overseas and taking them from countries we really shouldn't be taking them from. So they're my points. If we're having those discussions around, because you can deliver services, if you've got no one to deliver them, they're pointless.
Thank you very much. In terms of your point about the locality offer, you're absolutely right. I think the idea very much for when we re-procured the marketplace was it to go out into areas, but obviously the pandemic has made some of that a little bit tricky. However, that's very much a focus, and you've seen that within the strategy, that we want to get the care delivered at the right place in the right time. So we need to think about how we use our youth groups, how we use those settings to get other services out into the community, working with children and young people. So very much hear what you're saying there. In terms of additional investment over the last year, that's come down from NHS England in terms of service development funding in response to the increased presentations through the pandemic. We've also, the money for the mental health support teams, again, is through us bidding to NHS England for that additional investment. And in terms of discussions regionally about the workforce, it is acknowledged regionally, it's acknowledged nationally. And there is currently in development, and there's a lead for this across the West Yorkshire Children and Families programme of work for a West Yorkshire Children and Young People's mental health workforce strategy, because every area is suffering the same challenges. And we also know that we're all sort of stealing from our own as well, moving around the patch, and how do we grow our own. And the mental health support team model is one in which we're starting to grow our own. There's a number of emotional mental health practitioners that sit within those teams who attend university to train themselves up to the next level. So that's a grow your own model as well. And we're looking at within the transitions team within CAMS as well, about how we take some of those members of staff and start to grow our own and look to third sector organisations who do that really well.
Sorry, and the one other piece I wanted, it says in paragraph 68, face-to-face delivery has been placed on hold as 0 to 19 FINS, Public Health Integrated Nursing Service, colleagues are being asked to support. Do you have any idea when that's going to stop and you're going to get public health? Because there's stuff about co-location, etc., which I assume is being held up because you're moving staff around, not you, but the service is moving staff around because of the pandemic, I assume.
Yeah, there has been a hold and there has been movement. I believe that we're getting slowly back to normal. A lot of that was in response to, I think when I wrote the paper, Omicron was still sort of, we weren't quite sure exactly what was going to happen. And we've seen that the impact's not been as huge. So we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago with that service, and services are starting to move back to that face-to-face and moving towards all the developments that we wanted to see.
Councillor Renshaw.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to pass a comment really, and it's following on from what Councillor said about training nurses. And I know it costs the student to train to be a nurse, and that is one of the reasons why we can't get the young people to train. So I just wondered if there was any government legislation in place to address the issue of training nurses free like we used to do while they're doing the practical. Was there any forthcoming regulations that you're aware of, or are they still having to pay for training?
I'm not aware of any forthcoming legislative changes that would make that impact. However, there are things that we can do as a city to try and support people. So we do have an academy which is set up across health and care in the city that I'm sure will have presented here at time to time. And we've recently been working in partnership with them to develop a range of access routes. So you might have seen online, there's both a career campaign and a Next Step Leeds campaign. The career campaign is focused on attracting people who have experiences of caregiving in their day-to-day life. So we're thinking about mums returning to work after recently having children into a career profile, and providing them a range of free support options in terms of training and mentoring to help them develop into care assistant roles, with an idea of being fast-tracked through into supported roles and gaining perhaps registrant positions in the future. So we're doing what we can in the city to make those roles attractive for people, and also to advertise them in local areas where we know employment could actually improve health outcomes. So we're trying to target it from both sides.
Yeah, but that's for carers, isn't it? But what about the nursing side as well? Is that the same?
That is the same. We've done it as a unified approach because we feel, as Jane described, sometimes in the city we rob Peter to pay Paul. So we felt it was really important to develop a unified programme. We've come together to consolidate all our vacancies and look at what the needs are in the hospital, what the needs are in community services, what we need in care homes, and then help people fast track into those jobs when they're looking for employment and we're looking for people with caregiving skills. So the idea being that we don't move people around the system. And if someone then gets in contact and says, well, I'd really like a development opportunity and I'm currently working in this setting, we can maybe look at how we can develop them in that place rather than moving them around the city, which seems the best way to hopefully use what we have.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not seeing any more questions or comments. So if we can move to the recommendations on page 20. So recommendation 1, are we happy to note and recognise the developments achieved under the Future in Mind strategy 2021 to 26? I'm quite sure that we are. Number 2, are we happy to note the breadth and connection between partners and practitioners across the system and thank them for their continued commitment? I think we're certainly happy to do that. And item 3, are we happy to recognise that there's more to do with all the caveats listed below? I think I think we have a consensus. So if I can thank you very much for bringing this. It's been a really interesting presentation. Particularly thank you for your patience. I know you've been waiting for quite a while, but we're very grateful to you. So thank you very much. Okay, so we have, I think, agreed to defer item 8 and item 9 to a future meeting, unless anyone's desperate to stay longer and call everybody back. No. Yeah. So item 10 is the work schedule. So I'll hand over to Angela.
Thank you, Chair. So as usual, the latest work schedule is appended at Appendix 1. And just briefly, Chair, just to point out that the next formal meeting on the 30th of March, it is currently scheduled to be the last formal planned meeting, but obviously based on the earlier conversations and the commitment that this board will bring back the findings arising from the notification of serious incidents review, just mindful that that's expected. The timeliness of that is, as they said, end of March. There's no guarantee it would be in time for our 30th of March meeting. So I guess there'd be a conversation through the chair about whether we do plan a further meeting. Separate to that, the evidence sessions linked to the exclusion elective home education off rolling. The plan is that they're held remotely as working groups, so that's not necessarily a formal public meeting. So we do have April, we do have up to the AGM in May, so we can have separate conversations about scheduling any additional meeting.
Thank you very much, Angela. So all that leaves is item 11, which is the date and time of the next meeting, which is Wednesday, the 30th of March at 10 o'clock, with the usual pre-meeting at 9:45. And if I can thank you all for sticking with us this morning, it's been quite a heavy and lengthy session. Very grateful to Helen, who has captured a phenomenal amount of notes, and particularly to Angela for all the work she's done in helping to pull everything together for this morning. So with that, thank you all for your contribution.